She gave a bowl of soup to a freezing man who asked for nothing. He sat quietly in the corner of her diner, ignored by most, forgotten by all. The next morning, 17 black government vans surrounded the building, and 200 soldiers stood outside in complete silence. She had no idea who he really was, or what would happen next. What followed left an entire town speechless. Stay with us to find out how it ends, and don't forget to subscribe. Willow Creek, Montana, October 2012. The air carried the first bite of winter, crisp and dry, brushing across cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. The town was small, one of those places where people still nodded at each other out of habit, but rarely asked how anyone was really doing. Most houses bore chipped paint, leaning mailboxes, and porches sagging under the weight of forgotten seasons. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the trees along Main Street clung stubbornly to their last leaves, gold and brittle against the wind. On the south end of town, tucked between an aging laundromat and a gas station with a flickering sign, stood Dale's Griddle, a family diner with a grease-stained awning and windows fogged from the heat inside. Every morning before sunrise, the place came to life under dim yellow lights and the faint hum of an old jukebox that played classic country songs on a loop. The smell of frying bacon and brewed coffee drifted out into the parking lot long before the first customer arrived. Haley Monroe, 40 years old, had opened the diner alone that morning, just like she did every other day. She moved with quiet efficiency, her sneakers scuffing the linoleum floor as she restocked napkins, cracked eggs into the griddle, and wiped down menus still marked with yesterday's fingerprints. The ritual was muscle memory now. Mechanical, precise, unchanging. She lived above the old pharmacy warehouse just 2 blocks from the diner, in a small rented room with peeling wallpaper and a single window that overlooked the alley. The radiator clanged at night, and the plumbing made a sound like coughing ghosts, but it was enough. Her mother, now bedridden in a long-term care facility across town, relied on Haley's visits and monthly payments to stay in a decent wing. Her younger brother, a soldier stationed with the National Guard, received a check from her every other Friday, even if it meant Haley skipped meals or walked to save on gas. She spoke little, laughed less, and blended into the background of Willow Creek, like the faded lines on the crosswalks. People respected her, at least in the way small towns respected those who endured, but few really knew her. She never asked for favors, never shared too much, and never broke the rhythm of her long, quiet days. Her apartment had no television. Most nights she sat at the small kitchen table under the yellow light of a crooked lamp, writing lists in an old notebook, things to buy, bills to cover, reminders to call the nurse about her mother's medications. Some pages were marked with scribbles of hope, job ads she never answered, recipes she never tried, names of places she dreamed of visiting before everything became about staying afloat. That morning, as the sky slowly shifted from black to pale gray, Haley moved through the diner with the calm of someone who had stopped expecting surprises. She turned the open sign over, locked the register, and poured herself the first coffee of the day. No cream, no sugar, just heat and caffeine. Outside, headlights passed without stopping. Inside, the radio played a worn-out George Strait ballad as the griddle hissed softly in the background. Everything was quiet, predictable, and still. And for Haley, that was enough. Friday evening settled over Willow Creek like a gray curtain, heavy and slow. The wind had picked up around sunset, sweeping brittle leaves into restless spirals along the sidewalks and rattling the old window panes of Dale's Griddle. The sky had darkened to a dull leaden shade, and the scent of cold rain clung to the air like a warning. Inside the diner, the warmth of fried food and cheap coffee created a shallow comfort, broken only by the flicker of overhead lights and the low murmur of conversation between scattered customers. The bell above the door jingled softly as a man stepped inside. He stood for a moment just past the threshold, rainwater pooling beneath his worn boots. His clothes were layered but insufficient, a faded flannel beneath a torn denim jacket, both soaked through. His knit cap sagged to one side, stained and stretched from years of wear. On the front, a military insignia barely clung to the fabric, almost erased by time and dirt. His eyes, rimmed red from cold or something deeper, scanned the room without focus. He looked not for a familiar face, but for a space to exist in without disturbance. He moved slowly, limping slightly, and took a seat at a corner booth near the window, where condensation blurred the view of the near-empty parking lot. Outside, a rusted pickup truck leaned sideways in its space, its rear tire visibly deflated, its tailgate held shut with rope. The man kept his eyes low, his shoulders hunched and his hands tucked into the sleeves of his coat. He didn't speak. He didn't remove his hat. He simply sat, quietly absorbing the warmth of the room, like someone who hadn't felt it in days. A pair of teenagers near the door exchanged glances. An older couple near the register stirred their coffee without sipping. One man stood, pulled on his coat, and left without paying much attention to his half-eaten meal. Whispered conversations picked up, nothing direct but loud enough to indicate discomfort. The stranger didn't react. He didn't seem to hear. Or maybe he'd learned long ago to ignore such things. Behind the counter, Haley had been refilling a jar of sugar packets when she noticed the shift in atmosphere. Her eyes followed the gaze of the others until they landed on the man in the corner. She paused, wiping her hands on a towel, then stepped back, watching from behind the coffee machine. The man hadn't picked up a menu. When the waitress approached with one, he only gestured faintly, requesting a glass of water. Nothing more. The manager of the diner, a short, broad-shouldered man with a combed mustache and a habit of watching the staff more than the customers, leaned in from the kitchen and gave Haley a pointed look. A glance that said not to make a scene, not to turn this into a problem. She turned away from him and instead walked to the kitchen pass-through window. A bowl of tomato soup sat beneath the heat lamp, returned by a customer who didn't want anything too red. Next to it, a slice of toasted bread curled slightly at the edge. Haley slid them onto a clean tray, added a cloth napkin, and poured a fresh glass of water. She carried it to the man in the corner and placed it in front of him without a word, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. He looked up briefly, nodded once, and lowered his gaze again. No one in the diner clapped, no one smiled. The background hum of the radio continued, playing a song no one was listening to. A young woman near the door sighed audibly and rolled her eyes. The atmosphere in the diner thickened. Not loud, not angry, but tense in the way a room gets when someone does something inconveniently decent. The man ate slowly, carefully, as though each movement hurt. He used the napkin to dab his mouth, drank the water in small sips, and did not touch the bread until the soup was nearly gone. When he finished, he sat for a while, hands resting on the table, as if trying to decide whether to say something or disappear. Eventually, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of fabric, creased and smudged with age. He placed it on the table, folded neatly over a napkin, then stood and walked to the door without turning back. Rain had started again, thin, persistent, and cold. As the door swung shut behind him, a gust of wind swept into the diner, extinguishing the smallest candle on the corner table. Haley stepped over to the booth and picked up the fabric. It was an old military patch, threadbare, the stitching frayed. She held it for a moment before slipping it into her apron pocket. No one said anything. The chatter had gone quiet. The remaining customers sat still, their eyes fixed on their cups or their phones as though pretending nothing had happened. The warmth of the diner had shifted, still physically there but dulled, as though a reminder had passed through that not all stories were told on clean plates and smiling receipts. Haley returned to the counter and resumed wiping down the coffee machine, her back straight, her hands steady, the patch resting against her side. Saturday morning arrived with a pale sky and a cold wind that rattled the flag outside Dale's Griddle. The quiet hum of the town hadn't changed, but inside the diner, something had shifted. The morning rush passed uneventfully. Haley worked her station as usual, refilling coffee, clearing plates, moving on autopilot. But just past 10, she was called to the back office. The manager, seated behind a scratched laminate desk, spoke with practiced calm. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just policies, protocols, and consequences. She had broken company rules, created a liability, and most damaging of all, called attention to the business in the wrong kind of way. She was offered severance, minimal, and a few pages of paperwork to sign. The conversation ended quickly. There were no goodbyes from coworkers, no lingering glances, just the quiet thud of the door closing behind her as she stepped out into the street, apron folded over her arm, hands still faintly smelling of bleach and coffee grounds. By noon, the video had surfaced online, a short, grainy clip from the diner's security camera. It showed Haley placing the tray in front of the man in the corner, her body blocking the view of his face. The clip had no sound, just muted movement and the implication of something too kind for policy. Someone trimmed it down, added a caption. Another bleeding heart. Hero or staged. It was reposted on local pages, then shared beyond. The comments poured in. Some offered cautious sympathy. Most did not. The silence that followed wasn't physical. It was social, weighty, and suffocating. In Willow Creek, people didn't confront, they withdrew. The clerk at the grocery store no longer said her name. The nurse at her mother's facility avoided eye contact. Her next-door neighbor, who once brought her leftover soup in winter, now simply turned and walked inside when their paths crossed. At home, Haley sat at her small kitchen table, filling out job applications with trembling fingers. She sent resumes to diners in 3 neighboring towns, even gas stations and motel cafes. No one called. No one even sent a rejection. Days passed in slow unease. Her savings account dropped below $100. The food in her fridge dwindled to condiments and a half-empty carton of eggs. She visited the care home on Wednesday. The head nurse explained that without an updated payment, her mother could not remain in her current room. A downgrade was possible, but it was shared, and the waiting list was long. Haley nodded, silently absorbing the blow, the shame curling in her stomach like cold iron. That night she didn't sleep. Her apartment, already too quiet, felt like a hollow shell. She paced, counted bills, tried to call old friends, and hung up before the line rang through. There was no one to talk to who hadn't already chosen a side, or worse, no longer cared. On Friday evening, after walking aimlessly for hours, Haley cut through the park on her way home. The wind had died down, but the air was damp, and the ground slick with the remnants of rain. Near a bench beneath the skeletal branches of a maple tree, she spotted the man again. He lay curled on his side, wrapped in a long, stained coat that barely covered his legs. A plastic bag served as a makeshift pillow. His breath rose faintly in the cold air. She approached quietly, set a plastic container near the bench, a sandwich, a boiled egg, a slice of pie she couldn't afford to eat herself. He didn't stir. She didn't wait. As she turned and walked away, she didn't notice the black van parked half a block down, partially obscured by a row of trash bins. The vehicle sat idle, engine off, windows tinted. Inside, a man in uniform watched through a narrow crack in the window, silent, unmoving, recording the time, the date, and the woman's name. Sunday dawned quiet over Willow Creek. The sky held a pale amber hue, filtered through a mist that clung low to the rooftops. The streets were still, almost hollow, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Only the hum of tires on asphalt broke the silence as a line of black government vans rolled through the empty avenues. Their windows were dark, their movements measured and deliberate. They turned off Main Street and came to a stop beneath the rusted fire escape outside Haley Monroe's apartment. The first door opened slowly. From within stepped men and women in uniform, some in the deep green of the Army, others in the blue of the Air Force, and a few in the desert tones of National Guard service. There were older veterans among them, walking with canes or a slight limp, and younger officers whose posture still bore the shape of discipline. One by one, they formed a line along the narrow sidewalk, facing the building with quiet purpose. Upstairs, Haley had just pulled on her robe when the knock came. The apartment still smelled faintly of last night's reheated soup, and the floor was cold beneath her feet. She opened the door cautiously, still bleary-eyed from another restless night. The man standing in the hallway wore a pressed uniform and held a folder under one arm. His expression was calm, composed, but his presence filled the narrow space with gravity. He introduced himself as the son of the man she had fed days earlier. His voice was steady, and his eyes carried the weight of history. His father, he explained, was Colonel Jonathan Reeves, once a decorated officer who had led a battalion through some of the bloodiest stretches of the war in Afghanistan. Reeves had received honors for carrying wounded soldiers through enemy fire, shielding his men in ambushes, and refusing evacuation until the last man was safe. But after the war, the world had not welcomed him back kindly. He had buried his wife, lost contact with his remaining family, and drifted from place to place until even his name faded from military records. Haley listened in silence, the details landing one after another like distant thunder. She had no idea who the man in the booth had been. She hadn't asked. She hadn't needed to. An hour later, the center of Willow Creek stirred from its quiet Sunday slumber to something entirely unfamiliar. Vans lined the street in front of Dale's Griddle. Uniformed service members, some in dress blues, others in decorated field attire, stood in a long formation from the diner's entrance down the block. Bystanders gathered in hushed confusion, shop owners stepping out of their doors, elderly couples pausing mid-walk, children pressing their faces to windows. The Reeves family had arrived in full, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, all dressed in dark coats and carrying framed photos, service medals, and clippings from years past. Behind them came fellow soldiers, some of whom had served under Jonathan Reeves. Their faces bore the hard lines of time, but their presence was unshakable. The local press had shown up first, then regional networks. Reporters adjusted microphones, cameras flicked on, and recorders were held steady as Colonel Reeves's son stepped forward before the crowd. He stood in front of Dale's griddle, the windows of which now reflected the crowd gathering across the street. Inside, the owners peeked out nervously, faces pale behind the glass. The colonel's son read from a prepared statement, his voice clear, unwavering. He spoke of honor, of sacrifice, and of the quiet moments when character reveals itself. He told the story of a waitress who offered warmth to a man no one else would look at, and how that gesture reached further than anyone could have imagined. He held up a certificate, embossed with a gold seal from the Department of Veterans Affairs, naming Haley Monroe a recipient of civilian recognition for acts of dignity and service beyond expectation. When he turned and handed it to her, the gathered soldiers snapped to attention and saluted in unison. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes. The owners of the diner moved back from the window and pulled the blinds shut. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap, slowly at first, then louder. Others joined, until a ripple of applause swept down the sidewalk and echoed through the narrow street. Some townspeople stood motionless, unsure of what to feel. Others looked away, shamed by their own silence days before. But a few, old friends, quiet strangers, stepped forward, eyes wet, hands on their hearts. Haley didn't speak. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, holding the certificate with both hands, her shoulders still, her robe now replaced by a simple coat. She felt the weight of everything, not just the moment, but the days before, and the cost behind each step she had taken. The applause died down, the wind picked up again, and in that stillness, Haley took a breath that felt like something more than survival. It felt, for the first time in a long while, like belonging. A week passed, and with it came the slow unraveling of everything Dale's griddle had once stood for. The diner, once a staple of morning routines and late-night coffee refills, now sat dark behind drawn blinds. The neon sign in the window, once buzzing quietly through the night, had gone cold. The owners issued no public statements. They simply stopped unlocking the door. Customers had vanished, first in hesitation, then in protest. The silence from the building matched the one that had surrounded Haley Monroe in the days before the soldiers arrived. Only now it belonged to someone else. Haley's days changed as quietly as the leaves began to fall. The trees turned orange and red and dropped their colors into the gutters. The morning air held a crispness that hinted at winter. She no longer wore her uniform apron or stood behind a counter. Instead, she found herself seated at a borrowed desk inside her small apartment. A letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs opened in front of her. It was formal and concise, but behind the wording lived something rare, an invitation, a chance. They offered her a position as a regional coordinator for a new pilot program aimed at addressing homelessness among veterans in the western part of the state. There was no hesitation. She accepted within the hour. The work began modestly. The program had no permanent space, no set team, only a few government grants and the goodwill stirred by recent events. But in Willow Creek, something had shifted. Veterans who had watched the tribute came forward to volunteer. College students from a neighboring town drove in on weekends. Local reporters followed the story and amplified the message. Donated supplies arrived from nearby cities: blankets, canned goods, toiletries, medical kits. The support came not as a flood, but as a steady current, driven by quiet people who had seen something in Haley that they recognized in themselves. Within 2 weeks, Haley secured access to a decommissioned elementary school on the edge of town. The district had shuttered it 4 years earlier due to budget cuts, but the building remained intact. She walked through the long abandoned hallways, her footsteps echoing against locker-lined walls, and saw not neglect, but possibility. The cafeteria became a dining space. Classrooms were cleared, scrubbed, and outfitted with cots and dressers. The old gym was turned into a rec room with bookshelves, board games, and a record player that only worked when the needle sat just right. They called it Willow House. It opened with little fanfare, no ribbon cutting, no podium speeches, just doors unlocked one morning and warm food on the table. Word spread quickly. The first to arrive were men like Jonathan Reeves, quiet and cautious, carrying everything they owned in worn backpacks. Some stayed for a night, others stayed longer. They helped fix things, painted walls, cooked meals. There were moments of tension, of course, memories that stirred too easily, silence that came from more than shyness. But slowly, the building filled not only with people, but with noise. Laughter drifted down the hallways. Someone played old army songs on the out-of-tune piano in room 4B. Bread baked fresh in the kitchen, its scent reaching every corner of the space. Haley moved through the rooms with calm authority. She wasn't in charge because of a title, but because she showed up. Every morning, every evening. She sat with newcomers, made grocery runs, cleaned bathrooms. Her hands were always busy, her eyes always aware. For the first time in years, her life was no longer about surviving. It was about building something that mattered. Her mother, too, was doing better. The Veterans Assistance Fund had covered the cost of a full-time care suite in a reputable elder care facility closer to the city. Haley visited every Thursday, bringing fresh fruit and books. Her mother, though tired and often slow to speak, smiled more now. The nurses said the room always smelled like cinnamon on the days Haley came. One afternoon, after a long day of inventory sorting and volunteer coordination, Haley found an envelope in her mailbox. The handwriting was messy but familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper from her younger brother, still deployed overseas. He had seen the story on a news segment shared through a military network. His words were short but sharp in their impact. He told her he had watched it 3 times, that other soldiers had crowded around a laptop to see it, that she had made them proud. At the bottom of the letter, he wrote that he'd always looked up to her, but never more than now. Haley sat for a long while with the letter in her lap. Outside, the wind carried leaves down the quiet street in slow, spinning circles. Somewhere in the building, someone was laughing. A kettle whistled in the kitchen. The floor creaked beneath approaching footsteps. And in that moment, she understood what it meant to feel not just useful, but necessary. Not just present, but alive. A year had passed. The seasons had turned through their familiar cycle, and the town of Willow Creek had drifted gently into another autumn. The old diner that once buzzed with the hum of conversation and clinking dishes now sat lifeless. Its windows were boarded up, the awning faded to a dull gray, and weeds had begun to creep through the cracks in the sidewalk around it. A for lease sign hung crooked in the front window, its corners curled with time and weather. No one stopped to look inside anymore. Across town, on the edge of the city limits, Willow Kitchen had become something steady and quietly miraculous. The building that had once been a shuttered elementary school now pulsed with new life. Mornings brought the smell of coffee and bread rising in the ovens. Afternoons echoed with voices, some gentle, some firm, but all belonging. Volunteers came and went. Regulars returned not out of necessity but comfort. There were no forms to fill out, no explanations required. If someone was hungry, they ate. If someone was tired, they rested. If someone was grieving, they were allowed to be still. One mild afternoon, as the trees began to scatter their leaves along the curbs in gold and copper, a boy arrived. He couldn't have been more than 9. His backpack was oversized, nearly swallowing his thin frame, and one of the straps had been patched with duct tape. His ears stuck out slightly from beneath a knit cap, and his sneakers were mismatched in color. He stepped through the front doors without hesitation, carrying a small box wrapped in a paper bag. Inside, Haley was restocking shelves with dry goods when she noticed him. He held the box out with both hands. Its contents were simple, homemade cookies, slightly misshapen, but baked with care. He had brought them to share, he said. No fanfare followed, no phones were raised, no one asked his name. Haley accepted the offering with a quiet nod, her face softening as she led him to the kitchen prep table. He washed his hands, then joined the other volunteers in setting out trays and silverware. He moved with the careful determination of someone who had learned to pay attention. By dinner time, he was laughing with another child, carefully arranging napkins at each place setting. There were no speeches, no photos, no one rushing to document the moment, and yet it felt significant. It felt whole, the kind of small good thing that needed no witness to matter. That evening, after the last plates had been cleared and the hallway lights dimmed, Haley sat alone by the wide window near her office. A mug of coffee, still warm, rested in her hands. The sun had dipped low, casting a copper hue across the pavement outside. Through the glass, she could see the lamplight stretching long shadows across the sidewalk and the faint steam from the kitchen chimney disappearing into the evening air. In her lap, she held a patch of fabric, the military insignia left behind a year ago by a man who had come in from the cold. The edges were frayed, but she had kept it clean, folded carefully in a small wooden box until that night. Next to her on the table sat a photo in a modest wooden frame, Jonathan Reeves in uniform, half smiling. Beneath the photo, a brass plate bore the words, "Humanity begins with a bowl of soup." She looked out at the street lamp standing like a sentinel before the front door. People still came through those doors every day, some with nothing, others with more than enough. The rule had never changed. No one was turned away. Haley exhaled slowly. Her life had shifted not because of any award or attention, but because on one cold night, she had made a quiet decision not to turn away. That choice had grown roots. It had drawn others close. And now, in this place, she was no longer alone. Outside, the wind picked up gently, carrying the smell of firewood and bread through the emptying streets. Inside, Willow Kitchen glowed with quiet life, and the warmth that filled its walls had nothing to do with the temperature. It was something deeper, something earned, something shared.